He'd been unfortunate enough to join Windermere in December, a time when high seas and constant storms caused a closing of the hold's portals. Fresh air was minimal. The men rarely bathed, and many spent their off-duty hours drinking rum, so the crew's quarters smelled like one of Liverpool's oceanfront taverns. Dirty clothing, sweaty bodies, alcohol fumes. Rowlands contributed to the smell by getting violently seasick. He spent the first 3 days of the trip vomiting. On deck, the air was fresh and crisp, but being on deck meant being put to work. The labour was bone-chilling and sometimes deadly. The tar-covered ratlins had to be climbed every time shifting winds or weather conditions caused a sail change. The smallest boys, like Rowlands, were forced to climb highest into the swaying rigging, then clamber out along the horizontal yards to furl or unfurl the topsails. A slip meant a long fall to the deck, or into the ocean. Weather conditions gradually improved as Windermere moved south, and by the time she sailed around the tip of Florida into the Gulf of Mexico, the air was balmy and the swells gentle and rolling. But Rowlands wanted out. New Orleans was a city of promise, where the air smelled of coffee, pitch, Stockholm tar, brine of mess beef, rum and whiskey drippings. Everything about New Orleans was surreal in its novelty. When, on his first night in town, Rowlands wandered into a brothel and was shown 4 girls in lingerie, he fled back to the ship in panic. 5 days later, unknowingly playing into Harding's plans, Rowlands answered New Orleans' siren song. He fled the ship without collecting his pay. It was February 1859. He had just turned 18. In Africa, Dr. David Livingstone was enduring his second Zambezi expedition. John Rowlands met Henry Hope Stanley during his first week in New Orleans. The British cotton merchant with the flowing beard was reclining in the morning sun outside his warehouse on Chapitula Street, reading a newspaper. It was 7 a.m. Rowlands walked by in search of work. "Would you like a boy, sir?" he asked. The young man's earnest demeanour impressed Stanley, who gave him a series of small tasks. One led to another, until Rowlands became a clerk. And while the relationship was merely that of a boss to a worker for Stanley, the middle-aged gentleman represented a surrogate father to Rowlands. He adored the older man so much that in 1859 he impulsively took the older man's name. John Rowlands was no more. He would spend the rest of his life as Henry Stanley. Morton was added years later, after other middle names were tried and found wanting. The young Stanley began coming round to his employer's house on Annunciation Square, unaware that men of the senior Stanley's class didn't fraternize with their employees. Henry Hope Stanley enjoyed his young employee's company, and was flattered that his young charge, whom he treated as a son, had taken his name. Both men enjoyed reading, and books were a constant in their relationship. Henry Hope Stanley's greatest gift to his erstwhile son, however, was to help him adopt an American attitude toward success. "I don't know what customs of the Welsh people may be, but here we regard personal character and worth, not pedigree. With us, people are advanced not for what their parentage may have been, but for what they are themselves." The words would function as a parting benediction, for the two men quarrelled in 1860. The younger Stanley was banished up the Mississippi. Stanley was living in Cypress Bend, Arkansas, when the Civil War began, working as a dry goods salesman at a general store on the Arkansas River. Cypress Bend was a swampy backwater and a breeding ground for mosquitoes. Stanley was stricken by his first dose of a malaria-like fever called ague, known in those parts as swamp fever. He endured the chills, headaches, and fever. Stanley felt alone and out of place in Cypress Bend, but he was in no hurry to find fellowship by joining the crush of local men enlisting to fight for the Confederacy. There was also a more pressing reason for him to stay in Cypress Bend. Stanley was in love. A local girl named Margaret Gorey had caught his eye, and with the men of Cypress Bend rushing off to war, he was on the verge of having her all to himself. Since Margaret seemed interested in him, too, the decision seemed wise. One day, he received a plain package from his newly beloved. In it was a chemise and petticoat. Margaret Gorey, in symbolic terms, was calling Stanley a coward. Desperate to prove his manhood, he enlisted shortly thereafter. Ironically, Stanley never saw Margaret Gorey again. By April of 1862, Stanley was on the front lines in one of the bloodiest engagements in American military history, the Battle of Shiloh. 10,000 men died on both sides in less than 24 hours of fighting. Stanley survived, but was taken prisoner. He was sent to Camp Douglas, a prison camp just outside Chicago. Fleas, ticks, and lice raged through the hovels in which men were forced to sleep.